pay a steep price for poverty. Clearly, the people that pay the highest price are the poor themselves, but the cost of poverty to society as a whole far exceeds the cost to the poor. All of us here tonight, everyone in this country, is paying for poverty, and the price is steep. Let me start by emphasizing the cost of poverty on those who are poor. The most obvious cost is material deprivation, the lack of resources to provide basic needs. In fact, our official measure of poverty, which has been around for more than 50 years, focuses exclusively on this cost. The poor struggle to put food on the table, to pay bills, to make ends meet. 49 million Americans are what the USDA calls food insecure. These are people who skip meals, go hungry, or eat less nutritious food because they can't afford to eat better. Almost a third of them are children. But the costs of poverty go well beyond material deprivation. One of the greatest costs is vulnerability. Now, many poor families may, on the surface, seem like they're doing okay. They're holding down a full-time job, they're putting food on the table, and their kids are doing fine in school. But what that snapshot masks is that many of these families are just one bad event away from much more dire straits. And this pattern of cycling in and out of poverty is all too common. And this vulnerability makes it particularly challenging for our efforts to find permanent solutions, and these solutions often fail. And we've seen this right here in Tarrant County, where tens of thousands of young adults go to community college with the hopes of gaining the skills necessary to earn a living wage. The problem is that 9 out of 10 first-time full-time enrollees at Tarrant County College never finish their degree. Why? The most common reason people drop out is because life gets in the way. The car breaks down, somebody steals their computer, a child gets sick. These kind of events, when they confront the non-poor, it's an inconvenience. For the poor, it can be devastating. The combination of material deprivation and vulnerability means that the poor live in a state of stress and uncertainty. And this imposes an additional toll, a psychological one. There's new interesting research that shows that the mind actually works differently when we lack something. We become prone to tunnel vision, and we face reduced analytical capacity. Our IQ actually falls because of what researchers call a bandwidth tax, even if the scarcity is temporary or just perceived. So there's an interesting experiment that some researchers ran where they administered an IQ test that both rich and poor people performed equally well on. Then, for a subgroup of these study participants, they asked them to imagine that they're facing $300 in car repairs. And they asked them, how would you deal with this issue? And then they administered the simple IQ test. Again, the rich and poor performed equally well on the IQ test. For a third group, they asked them to consider, or imagine the situation where you're facing $3,000 of car repairs. And they asked them, how would you deal with that news? And then they administered the IQ test. For that group, the poor performed noticeably worse. And the key point of this experiment is that when we become stressed about the lack of resources, our ability to problem solve is diminished. And the effect is really quite large. The feeling poor reduces one's IQ on the order of magnitude of a full night without sleep. Now, I've had a lot of experience with students who have tried to pull all-nighters, and the result is not very good. And so this is a really important and big deal. There are plenty of other costs of poverty that the poor pay. They live in worse neighborhoods. They face greater crime victimization rates. They have worse health, and they're much more likely to be depressed. And if you're unlucky enough to be born into poverty, you're much more likely to experience poverty at some point in time as an adult. It is clear that poverty imposes a huge cost on its victims, and the largest toll falls on children. Anti-poverty advocates often emphasize this point when arguing for greater support for the poor. But I want to make a different argument. I want to make an argument for support for poverty reduction that's based on economic grounds. In this view, poverty burdens society as a whole, robbing it of its productive potential. One way to frame this question is, if we could eliminate poverty, how much bigger would our economy be? It may not surprise you that this is a very difficult question to answer, and it entails imposing a number of strong assumptions. But economists are rarely deterred by such obstacles. And on top of that, we actually have fairly good estimates of some of these costs. And this information can go a long ways of helping us understand the magnitude of this issue. Let me give you an example. An important economic cost of poverty is lost wages. Now, for years, economists have been studying the impact of growing up poor on your earnings as an adult. The best estimates from this literature suggest growing up poor reduces your earnings during adulthood by 40%. So if you sum up all these earnings losses across all working age adults who grew up poor, and you subtract out the piece of it that can be attributed to hereditary factors, you get an estimate of the total earnings lost due to poverty of $170 billion a year. Two of the other biggest factors or costs, economic costs of poverty are crime and health. Collectively, the total cost of crime in the US exceeds $700 billion each year. Poverty can only be blamed for part of this cost, but poor youth are 1.3 times as likely to be involved in serious crime as compared to youth who live just above the poverty line. Moreover, they are committing 4 times as many violent crimes. By negatively affecting health, poverty imposes additional costs on society, including direct expenditures on health care to pay for those who become sick, and the lost productivity that results from reduced life expectancy. Recently, a study by 4 of the nation's most renowned poverty scholars tried to add up all of these costs. So they calculated the costs attributed to lost earnings, to worse health, and to increased crime. And when you add all of these up, the total bill is $500 billion a year. And this particular study was focusing only on child poverty. So this is, in large part, a lower bound estimate of the cost of poverty. And what it means is, if we could eliminate child poverty, we could reduce our capacity to consume goods and services by $500 billion a year, which is a big number. That's 4% of GDP, and that's a larger share of our economy than our current budget deficit. So why do I think it's so important to understand these social costs? Because these high costs imply that investments to reduce poverty are likely to have much higher social returns than previously thought. In other words, an intervention that is viewed as not cost-effective when evaluated based on its direct impact on participants might be viewed as cost-effective once you include these many broader social benefits. I should be clear that this is not a call for throwing more money at the problem. We already spend $1 trillion a year fighting poverty in the US. But the return we get from this investment is very unclear because we know very little about what works and what doesn't work. So what we really need is more R&D. We need to work hard to identify cost-effective programs that are replicable and scalable. And these programs need to focus on having a long-lasting impact by permanently lifting people out of poverty rather than just treating their temporary needs. After all, you don't get high social returns from a program that lifts people out of poverty for a day. If we are able to identify and scale up cost-effective programs that have a permanent impact on poverty, we will dramatically improve not only the lives of the poor, but of society as a whole. Thank you.